Hello and welcome to this Play Better Chess video. Today I'm covering chess tactics and strategy improvement, and I'll be going over a game that was played in 1912 by two great players of that time, Akiba Rubinstein, who had the equivalent strength of 2640, versus Frank Marshall with 2570. And I believe at that time Frank Marshall was the U.S. chess champion, and Akiba Rubinstein was one of the top players to be considered a contender for the World Chess Championship. He actually, in 1912, won about 5 tournaments, and it was considered the Rubinstein year. And he was one of the top players that should have played the world champion at the time, Emanuel Lasker, but it never happened. And Rubinstein went on to have some mental health problems. He was still considered one of the greatest players for a while, but unfortunately he never had a world championship match against Emanuel Lasker, and so that's a shame. But we're going to talk about chess tactics and strategy improvement by seeing what tactics and strategy these great players use. First, before I begin, I'll run this through a quick game review just to see what these players did. So it looked like the game was kind of even, and Rubinstein gains a slight edge before it just takes off here. And he played with 96.2% accuracy versus 88.3% by Frank Marshall. Let's see, one mistake by each player, but Marshall had 3 inaccuracies, and they both had one great move. All right, let's put on the chess computer analysis here as we go along. And the game begins with Akiba Rubinstein playing d4, and Frank Marshall responds with d5. So common queen's pawn opening here. They keep things equal in the center. And now Rubinstein just develops his knight on the king side, and immediately Frank Marshall, known as an attacking player, counters with this c5 pawn push, attacking the valuable central pawn on d4. So this is a good strategy here. If you have a more valuable central pawn, use one of your side pawns to attack it. And we notice that this pawn pushes out to c5 before the knight is developed. Otherwise, the knight, if it developed to c6 at some point in the future before this pawn moves forward, it would block in that pawn. And this pawn, we see, can be a valuable attacking force against this strong d4 pawn. Now, of course, white could just capture this pawn. It's a gambit. It could just capture this. But then this e pawn could push forward, and then we have a discovered attack by the bishop. So it would be hard to hold on to this pawn, and it would pull a valuable central pawn away from the center by taking this pawn. So generally you don't want to do that. A good strategy, especially in the opening, is to move your pieces once, get them all developed before you start attacking. In general. Now, there's always exceptions to the rule. This is quite interesting. Now, and apparently this is called the Krauss variation in the queen's pawn opening. We have Rubinstein copying Marshall. So, all these 4 pawns are just attacking each other here. So now Marshall just develops this pawn to e6. Now, one negative side to this strategy is that now this bishop is kind of blocked in, and Marshall is left with a bad bishop. So a strategy to remember is to try not trap your bishop in behind your own pawns. Maybe at some point, he could have played a little differently, getting the bishop outside of this pawn chain. But there's a lot of confrontation going on here with these pawns, so he probably wants to be able to bring his bishop out and also let the bishop be able to defend this pawn. And he's probably looking to castling quickly, which is another valuable strategy. All right. Immediately, Rubinstein attacks. So a good strategy here, capturing a central pawn with the less valuable flank pawn. And so Marshall retaliates here. And what does Rubinstein do? Well, he just develops a knight here. And already we see that there's a lead in development here by Rubinstein. So a good strategy is to go ahead and develop quickly, try to get your pieces developed more quickly than your opponent. So Marshall, finally develops a knight here, and he kind of adds pressure to this d4 pawn, but it's defended by a knight and queen here. So Rubinstein, he decides to fianchetto here, bringing his bishop to this g2 square where it will have control of the long diagonal, and if the knight moves, potentially piling up on this pawn, especially if the d pawn and c pawn are exchanged, and at some point this d pawn on d5 could become isolated. And that's another good strategy, is to try and leave your opponent with an isolated pawn and then trade off the pieces around that pawn, so it's harder for that pawn to be defended or pushed forward, and it becomes a harder pawn to defend once more and more pieces have been traded off. Okay, so Marshall develops the other knight, and now we have bishop developed, and finally another capture here in the center. So the knight recaptures, and now we have Marshall just adding pressure to this knight, which is only defended by the queen here. So what does Rubinstein do? Well, he plays the best move in the position, retreating the knight and attacking the bishop. So now, this is another good strategy, attacking your opponent's bishop and forcing it to move again. But Marshall, ever the attacker, he just pushes his bishop forward and pins this knight, perhaps threatening to capture and leave Rubinstein with an isolated pawn. So that is ignored, and the best move is played, because also this knight, if we go back one, the knight is pinned. So this is a good tactic to look out for, a very simple tactic, but to pin a piece. So here we would have an absolute pin because this knight cannot move. It would be illegal because then the king would be in check. And then you can threaten in the future possibly to push a pawn and add to the pinned piece. Whenever you pin a piece, a good tactic is to add more attackers to that pinned piece. So, that could have been a possibility. And to alleviate that problem, immediately Rubinstein castles, getting out of this pin. And so Marshall captures here, giving up his bishop pair. So generally, you want to keep the bishop pair, as now, once this bishop, the dark squared bishop, has been traded off, Rubinstein will have this dark squared bishop to help control all the dark squares on the board, and Marshall no longer has a bishop to counter that. Now, in exchange for giving up his bishop pair, he does leave Rubinstein with two isolated pawns, but then again, Marshall has an isolated pawn as well. So castling here is played by Marshall, and the computer says that's a great move. I don't know if it's so great. It's just a normal developing move. You want to castle. A great strategy is castle early, castle often is the saying, because I've mentioned this before in other videos. Whenever you castle, it really limits the attacking angles that your opponent have on your king. If you leave your king in the center, it can be attacked from straight on and left or right. But once you castle, now the king can only be attacked from straight on or from one side. Nothing can come from off the board over here on the right. All right. The game continues with Rubinstein just developing the other bishop and pinning this knight. So now we have Marshall developing as well, helping fortify his pawn here, which is isolated. So the game continues with a piece being moved before all the pieces have been developed. So this is an interesting move here, because generally a strategy when you play in the opening is to get all your pieces developed. So we still have, the rooks to be developed, the queen to be developed, maybe move the queen up and get the rooks connected where they can back each other up, and it gives them more room to maneuver. Generally, a good strategy is to put your rook on maybe a half open file or a completely open file if there's any available, or place your rook behind pawns that you plan to move forward. So what does this move do? Well, in the game, in your own chess games, you want to look for checks, captures, or threats. All right. Before you make a move, look for checks, the most forcing moves. All right, there aren't any checks here that white could have made. Then you want to look for captures. Could anything be captured? Maybe the knight could be captured, but then you could have a recapture. Now, if the queen recaptured, well, then you could possibly have this attack here. But, then that could lead to a tactic of pinning the bishop to the queen here. But I won't go into that. Let's see what this move did. This is a threat. So the threat is not only knocking out this bishop possibly and maybe leaving a backward pawn, but more importantly, we have this b7 pawn here that's unprotected. So what does Marshall do? Well, he develops the queen and protects the pawn. So the difference between beginning chess players and better and more advanced players is that they try and make a move that accomplishes more than one thing. So here we see that this queen is developed off the back rank, which is a strategy, a goal that you want to achieve in your own games, is to get your pieces off the back rank, your queen, your knights, and your bishops, and then the rooks, you want them connected with nothing in between, so that they have freedom to maneuver and reposition to better files, like the maybe the half open E file or C file, or getting behind the isolated pawn on the D file. But back to this queen move. It allows the rooks to be connected. It gets the queen off the second rank. It protects this pawn, and it also attacks the knight here, which is unprotected. So what does Rubinstein do? He knocks out the other bishop here. And Marshall captures towards the center. Another good strategy here. It's always good to capture towards the center with your pawns. If you have a choice between capturing away from the center or towards the center, usually it's good to capture towards the center. But remember, these are general chess strategy guidelines, and that you also have to do a little bit of calculation because there's always exceptions to the rule. But now, after this, it leaves Frank Marshall with 2 central pawns versus Rubinstein's 1 central pawn. So that could be a slight advantage. But at the moment, this pawn is backwards. So what does Rubinstein do here? Well, he decides, and apparently this is the best move, he attacks this pawn. So that strategy, again, of using your flank pawns on the sides to attack the more valuable central pawns. So, this kind of forces Marshall to make a decision. Does he ignore this? Does he capture? And then his valuable central pawn will be pulled to the side here and become a flank pawn. But it will be a passed pawn. So the pawn is captured, and it is a free pawn at the moment. So at the moment, Marshall is ahead in material, but it looks like the evaluation is still almost a pawn's worth of material in favor of Rubinstein here. So how does the game continue? We have the knight capturing. Okay, so what does this accomplish? The bishop pair is given up, but now Marshall is left with these 2 doubled isolated pawns. He also has an isolated A pawn, and a strategy that can be used to your advantage is if you're able, actually he has 4 isolated pawns here. This pawn is isolated as well. So if you can create more pawn islands, and what are pawn islands? Well, it's just groups of pawns that are side by side or even single pawns. So we look here and we see that Rubinstein has 1 pawn island here with this lone pawn on A2, and then another pawn island here, these 4 pawns that are all side by side. Now, pawns that are side by side can more easily defend each other when they push forward. So, this E pawn could push to E3 and be defended. The F pawn could push forward and be defended by the G pawn. But if we look at Frank Marshall's pawns, now he has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawn islands. We could consider this island, these pawns are on the same file here, the C file, so they would be considered 1 island, I guess. But 4 versus 2, it'll be much easier to defend these 2 pawn islands versus 4 pawn islands and all these isolated pawns that Marshall has. All right, continuing on. The queen immediately centralizes. A good strategy to accomplish with your queen is to centralize the queen where it covers many more squares than it did here on the edge of the board. And now checks, captures, and threats. Well, there aren't any checks that can be conducted here against Frank Marshall. Captures, the bishop could have captured this knight. So once again, Rubinstein looks for threats. He moves his queen, centralizing it. So remember, I said it's always a good strategy to accomplish more than one thing with your moves. So this move here centralizes the queen, helping control the valuable central squares. It creates a threat of attacking this unprotected pawn. And also, it could be considered an attacking piece that's aimed at the king side, although there's not much the queen can do so far when it comes to attacking the king side. All right, moving on. Now we have an inaccuracy played by Marshall. So he had this queen developed, And now he just retreats back, attacking the queen. It looks like a better move would have been h6 to immediately put the question to the bishop and force the bishop to either retreat or capture the knight here. So the queen is under attack. Rubinstein ignores that, attacking the knight here, or capturing the knight, I should say, and backing the queen up. And apparently this was the best move to play here, because as more pieces are traded off, it will become harder and harder to defend all these isolated pawns. So the rook captures. Apparently it would have been better to capture with the queen, but the rook is captured. Now we have queen capturing, and material is even, but if we look at the computer evaluation, it's +1, a little more than +1 to white here. So centralization of the queen, the best move in the position. Now why is this best? Well, it creates a threat attacking the unprotected queen. If white captures here, it would help kind of get rid of the isolation that these two pawns have. One could capture, and then you would have a pair of pawns instead of two isolated pawns, and that would kind of get rid of the weakness of these two isolated pawns. So now, instead of worrying about this threat immediately, well, I guess this does handle the threat. So once again, a move that accomplishes more than one thing. We have a rook moving to the half-open file here, backing up the queen. This rook was not doing much at all, sitting on a1. So the rook develops. Marshall, who is an attacking player, does not want to capture. So I don't know. This move doesn't look so great here. Being an attacking player, Marshall doesn't trade queens off. But now Rubinstein could possibly do that. But let's see what he does. Rubinstein makes a mistake here. He attacks the queen. So creating a threat here, but apparently that wasn't the best move. It looks like f3 is what the computer recommends. So this is the move that was recommended, which I guess that blunts the scope of these two rooks, this rook battery. Now this is a good strategy when you can double your rooks up, especially on an open or half-open file. This move would have really limited the scope of these rooks and the scope of the queen, covering these light squares. So, I don't know, interesting move here that was not played. Instead, we had this mistake. So why is this a mistake? Let's see if we can find out here. Marshall does find the best move in the position. He keeps the queens on the board, moves over to the king side, perhaps getting ready to bring the rook to h6, threaten a mate here. So what does Rubinstein do? Well, he pushes the f-pawn, gaining space here on the king side, limiting the scope of the rook battery, and maybe threatening to push this pawn forward here, gaining even more space and kind of blocking out the queen from being able to do much in the center or on the queen side. So maybe Marshall was worried about that e5 pawn push blocking the queen out. And so we have queen to a5, a mistake, and apparently queen to g4 would have been better. So if we look at that move, this could have been an interesting tactic here. So this would have pinned the pawn, the G pawn, to the king. And then there would be a threat of capturing this pawn, and the pawn could not capture because of the pin. And so if the rook captured, the other rook could capture, and then we'd have pressure on this E pawn. So this would have been a better move for Frank Marshall. But in the game, we had this mistake, queen to a5. What does this do? I guess it protects this pawn. Maybe he was trying to protect his queen pawn to prevent a capture, and then a passed pawn on the queen side. So the e5 move is played, attacking the rook. The rook swings over to h6, the best move in the position. Adding some pressure to this h2 pawn, which is fine at the moment. The king is protecting it. And now we have the rook moving up to help protect this pawn. And queen to b6, grabbing the open diagonal, checking the king. The king moves up here. And now, what can be played by Marshall? Well, he grabs the open file with his rook. Rubinstein lifts his rook up to f2, where it works in tandem with his other rook. Remember, a good strategy is to use your rooks in tandem. Create batteries, have them on the same rank or file where they can back each other up. And sometimes you can even have the queen join in. So here we have a rook-queen battery. So one possibility could be to just capture this pawn, I guess. So let's see what happens. The pawn is protected. The rook grabs the open file now. The king runs into the corner. Apparently this is a serious inaccuracy. c5 would have been better to push the passed pawn forward. All right. So now this allows rook to d6, adding more pressure to this pawn along with the queen. And Rubinstein was known as one of the greatest endgame players, maybe of all time. A very powerful endgame player. Along with him, Capablanca is another amazing endgame player. Bobby Fischer, of course, was a great endgame player. Bobby Fischer was known to be kind of a mix of Capablanca and Rubinstein's endgame play. So we have a capture here, and as I mentioned, a tripling of two rooks and a queen. So Rubinstein has gone ahead in material. Now, I guess Marshall is playing defense here, really just holding up his king. Perhaps he is getting this rook behind the pawn because he plans to push it forward and attack here. But this will allow material to be traded off here, and this is the best move. So Marshall, ever the attacking player, tries to avoid a queen trade with a check here. So the king moves out of the line of fire. Marshall attacks again with the queen, and now we have a block. So interesting move here. And now this could lead to some complications. So what does Marshall do? Well, instead he just captures. Rook captures. So we have an even trade. The pawn is finally pushed forward here. Marshall is trying to, he's behind in material. So remember the strategy that if you're behind in material and he is behind one pawn, you want to try and trade off as many other pawns as you can. So if you're ahead in material, you want to trade off pieces, which is what Rubinstein has done here. So finally we have a capture, and now the pawn is captured and protected. So the attack here on the pawn, but look at this. Now this h-pawn pushes forward and the rook is trapped for the moment. But this pawn pushes forward, trying to get the rook out of this trapped area. Capture, rook captures. So now the rook is free. But Rubinstein is ahead 2 pawns at the moment. So we have a check. And now another tactic here. Checking the king, sending it running to an area where you can create a fork. And now we have the tactic of the fork. This is just a simple fork, checking the king, but forking the king and the pawn. So the king moves forward. A good strategy in the endgame is to activate your king, get that king moving into the action. So capture, the king attacks the pawn, but the rook protects here. And now we have Marshall retreating his rook, but this gives the rook more scope. It backs up, and from here it can move anywhere along this 8th rank and reposition to try and become more active. And in rook endgames, a lot of times the player with the more active rook may have the advantage, because that rook will be doing more than just playing defense like this rook is at the moment. So the king has moved forward to help in the endgame. And now we have the rook becoming more active here, grabbing this open file. And another good strategy in the endgame is to move your rook pretty much as far away from the opponent's king as you can. That way, the opponent's king cannot move to where it can harass your rook. So the rook is, of course, it's not going to go over here or it would be captured on the A file. So the B file is the next best thing. You move over here far away from the king. The king decides to move here. And why is this the best move? Well, I guess it allows you to push this G pawn and get these passed pawns moving forward, trying to promote here on the G or H file. But also, we have the rook moving down here, and where it can try and harass the enemy king. Also, there could be the option of getting behind the passed pawns. Another good strategy that you want to remember. Rooks belong behind passed pawns, whether they're yours or your opponent's. The next best thing is to put a rook beside the pawns. And usually the worst area for the rooks are in front of pawns because it blocks the movement of those pawns. And also, if it's an opponent's pawn that you're attacking, as that pawn pushes forward, if it's able to, it slowly limits the scope of your rook when the rook is in front of it. All right, so the rook drops back here, protects this pawn, which is interesting. Protects the pawn. Now we have a check. And the king is forced to drop back, but attacks the rook. So the rook moves as far away as it can, gets behind the passed pawn. And now we have a rook check here. Interesting move. And this is the best move. Because now, if the king captures this unprotected pawn, these passed pawns can start marching up the board. And the king will be trapped away from these pawns if it goes after this e5 pawn. And of course, that's what Marshall does. He's trying to get some kind of counterplay by being able to push this passed pawn. But now, a very good strategy here by Rubinstein, using his rook to restrict the king. Now he's cut off the king from being able to stop these pawns. So now we have Rubinstein dropping back to protect this passed pawn over here. And we notice that he did not push this pawn forward because the rook is really limited. It can't go forward at all, of course. If this pawn would have been pushed forward, there would have been the opportunity for the rook to move up and check the king. So now we have Marshall pushing his king forward, getting out of the way of the passed pawn, getting ready to try and march this pawn forward. And in the meantime, Rubinstein just starts running with his pawns up the board. So this H pawn is getting closer and closer to being able to promote. And, is this a good move? Maybe not. It says the best move would have been rook to c7 to immediately try and stop this pawn's forward momentum on h6 here. So the best move, bringing the g pawn forward. That way these two pawns can work together as they move forward. And counterplay by Marshall. He tries to run his pawn forward, so it's a race. The rook finally has to move up here to stop the pawn. But now the other pawn is pushing forward. We have an attack on the rook. That is ignored. So, interesting tactic here. The rook is left under attack. If this is captured, well, then we would have a pawn push here. And when you have two pawns on the 7th rank, the rook cannot stop them both. So what does Marshall do? He captures, getting rid of the rook here. And now he's ahead by +3 in material. But the game analysis is that Rubinstein is really ahead by +5.5 here. So the ending of the game goes with the pawn pushing forward. Now the king protects this pawn, but a queen is promoted here. So the final moves were king to e2, threatening to push this pawn, promote to a queen with check. But the final move was queen to e6 check. And so the bad thing about this move is that the king would be forced to move away. And then this pawn could be captured. And Rubinstein has these two extra pawns here. So this is where Frank Marshall resigned. If we go back, what would have been better instead of that move here? It looks like rook takes g8 would have been better here. So something like this. But then, the best thing would be capture, and then the queen promotes. And, once again, Rubinstein would be winning. All right, well, feel free to leave comments. This is supposed to be chess tactics and strategy, and it was mostly a lot of strategy. So, I'll do different games in this series in the future, and hopefully some of them in the future will have more tactics to show off. But this was more of a strategical game. There were some tactics, but a lot of strategy. All right, feel free to like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.